This week on Gravel, it's the deer episode. We've all been deer hunting here in early November in Nebraska, in Montana, Minnesota, and we're going to hear the stories about Eric Dinger's wife's first deer. It was a red-headed miracle. We also learned that Andrew is kind of the Mr. Miyagi of deer hunting. If you want to learn how to deer hunt, you're going to have to paint the fence and wax the car first. And then Bronson tries to freeze out a new hunter who didn't get all of the oil out of the firing pin, and, well, mayhem ensued. This week on Gravel.
Well, hello and hi. Welcome to another episode of On Gravel. This is the deer hunting edition. We just had a little pregame show, and it sounds like everybody is kind of getting a little rattled from the deer hunt. This is the second full week of November. It's hitting hard. And hi, gents. Are you as frazzled as I am?
I am, and if you hear rattling in the background, that is my black lab sitting here scratching herself. So I want to apologize for that background noise. It's not as glorious as the train passing through Glasgow, but it's what I've got.
You know, that's a really awful excuse for just scratching yourself during a recording. That's fine. Whatever you blame it on the dog. Wouldn't be the first time, would it?
Nope, and I don't do it in state parks anymore.
That's just because your wife was mad about the last episode.
Oh, she was infuriated that I engaged in the whole state park thing. So,
what state park thing?
That's right.
Dinger, how you doing?
I'm fantastic. I had a really fun weekend. Can't wait to talk about it.
I don't see anybody stopping you.
All right. Well, I'll start the deer episode then. So this weekend, we hunted my wife's family ground down by Fairbury, Nebraska, which is way in the southeast corner on the Little Blue River, which is this just incredible tree-lined, muddy, gross river that's surrounded by cornfields and just completely full of great deer. It's the kind of southeast Nebraska, northwest Missouri, southwest Iowa deer ground that you kind of dream about, honestly. We saw a pile of deer, including many bucks and lots of does and lots of rutting activity. But this was to be my wife's first crack at shooting a buck. She'd had a buck tag before, and we shot a little button buck right at last light on the last day of the season a couple years ago. And then she shot a doe the last 2 years. And so this was to be her chance to shoot a buck. We had scouted. We knew there was lots of deer around. We had the perfect wind, albeit a 1 mile an hour or a 1 degree real feel south wind, which is pretty rare in this part of the country in November. Usually a south wind brings some warm. But man, it was cold in the blind. We'd set up the night before and just in the perfect spot overlooking a little draw and a watering hole. And well, we layered up. We got to the blind. I forced myself to drink coffee. I just don't know how people do that, but it was so cold that I just decided I was going to man up for once. And, you know, I'd shave my mustache. So I'd shave my mustache so people could hardly tell I was even a man at all anymore.
They have this stuff called hot flavored chocolate water. Some people shorten it down to hot chocolate. You could have drank that.
Yeah.
Or hot tang.
Tea.
Hot tang.
Hot tang, my wife, she would not abide the hot tang. I think it's too erotic for her, honestly. Or it sounds too erotic.
Is it because the astronauts used to use it?
That's made up.
Look it up. Google it. All right, so you're in the blind drinking coffee.
We're in the blind. We're both 5 layers of clothing. We got a 15 mile an hour south wind in our face. We bought one of those new surround view blinds. Bronson, your company makes those. Oh, so sweet. Total game changer for the kids and for the adults. But so we're sitting in this fancy new blind, and we have deer immediately. First does, and then a little tiny buck. And we were talking about having her shoot just the first buck she saw. And so she was kind of sizing that one up. And right in behind it came this deer that we had seen right away at first light about 300 yards away running out of the place that we actually walked through to get to our blind. And it was a big, nice deer. It looked like a mature deer from a distance. And that deer, lo and behold, had run about a half mile in a circle and come right down into the little farm pond that was right in front of us, and chased that buck and those does out of there. And there he stood at 70 yards and looking at us. And so one of my favorite things about taking new hunters, and my wife being as excitable as she is, and you guys know her, she's pretty easy to get fired up. She's a redhead, so just picture the redhead in your life, and then imagine her shooting a deer. So she shakes like she has Parkinson's. I mean, it is legit. Like, it's we probably shouldn't laugh about Parkinson's, but you get the idea. She's shaking pretty bad, and so it's always a marvel to me that she can ever hit anything at all. But we're sitting in this cool new blind. We are cold as can be, and suddenly there's a mature deer right in front of us, and she shoots, and I'm looking at it through the binoculars, and I know she hits this deer. I know she hits it. She's shaking so bad, but the deer the deer flinches a little bit, but barely moves at all. And so I said, honey, you got to shoot again. And she's flustered, and she forgets how to run her bolt, which you do. You get buck fever and all hell breaks loose. And so she hurriedly shoots again, and the deer doesn't move at all. And the doe he was chasing was still there. The little forky buck had run off, and the deer doesn't move a second time. And then slowly the deer walks south away from us just a little bit for a minute or so. And she was really rattled by this time. She's probably going to be mad that I told this part of the story, but that deer was walking, but not well. And I thought for sure she had hit it pretty hard the first shot. But it just stood there. And soon enough, sure enough, it turns back around and comes back north towards us, and starts walking around behind that doe a little bit. And by this time, I'm holding the gun because she's in full shake. She's retching, basically. We thought she would hit it pretty hard the first time, and I actually thought it was walking south to go down. And so I said, I think it's going to go down. And so she's, about to have the rush that you get. And lo and behold, this thing turns back around and turns sideways. And I said, honey, do you want me to finish it? Because she was just sitting back and really rattled. And she's like, yeah, finish it. And so I knelt forward and got the deer in my scope, and it was standing there. And I was like, honey, I don't want to do this. You shoot it. So finally, I'm sure it was 3 seconds later, but it felt like forever. She's like, all right, let me shoot it. Let me do it. And she shoots again and gives it the final shot that it needed. And what's amazing to me, how you can hit anything when you're shaking that hard, I don't know, but she was. But she ended up smoking it pretty good the third time, and the deer ran about, 30 yards or so and fell, and we did the holy crap and congratulations and hug it out and everything, and then waited. You wait a little while. We could see where the deer went down, but we couldn't see the deer. And so we waited for, that, like, if only life passed at the pace of the time between when you shoot a deer and when you can go get it. Like, it's just slow, right? It was probably 15 minutes, but it felt like 3 hours. She's ready to go. I said, honey, let's give it 5 more minutes. And so in about 30 seconds, we get out of the blind, and we walk down to find her deer. It's probably, by my estimation, 110 yards, 120 yards away by this time, where we think it fell. And we look and look and look and look for a half hour. We know this deer went down right. We saw it down. And I'm sure you guys have stories like this too, but it fell right where we thought it fell, and we walked by it twice. Mm-hmm. And so I was another 200 yards past her when I heard the whoop, the unmistakable whoop of somebody who's found a deer. And so I flipped my camera on and came back over the hill, huffing and puffing, because it was A, cold, and B,
coffee.
Well, coffee. Yeah, coffee is the reason I was huffing and puffing. And there she was, and she got both arms up in the air, and she looks like a person whose emotions have completely overcome her. And I took a video of it. You can see it on our Instagram. But she went from shaking and oh my God and celebrating to, and with all due respect, she kind of lost her emotions. It was a very, very sweet moment her and I shared that it was overwhelming. You put up the time in to find a place and to get good with your rifle, and you're a new hunter and you're excited, and then it all works out on a deer probably well beyond what she even had pictured mentally, and it was overwhelming for her. And so she and I had a time where it was, there were some tears, and that's one of those probably 15 or 20-second periods of time where you just wish time would stop, because it was just her and I sharing a hug, and cold as could be, standing in the wind, and just the mix of emotions that go into that feeling were pretty awesome. So she killed herself a really beautiful mainframe 4x4 that had an injury on its back left leg. And my friend Brian Murphy at QDMA tells me that a lot of times when deer are hurt, the opposite, especially in their back leg, the opposite antler usually will have some sort of malformation. And so this deer has, I guess, what I would call a second main beam that's got a fork on it. And that antler has three antlers. It kind of drops straight perpendicular to the ground. And then its brow tine has it looks like an E. It has picture like a back scratcher you'd buy at a dollar store. That's what the brow tine looks like. So it's a pretty special deer. It had 5 on the other side. Well, it was a mainframe 4, but it had a little kicker on the other side too. So it was a really, really the coolest deer, frankly, I've ever seen shot. It was a really one-of-a-kind looking animal, and it was a 4.5-year-old, just healthy Nebraska whitetail, and a hell of a story to go with it. So we had ourselves a great morning, that's for sure. How about you guys?
I got a couple of questions about this. First of all, what's your Instagram so people can see this deer? Because the antler is pretty cool.
Yeah, we're at Powderhook. It's a great deer. It's not by any means going to be the biggest deer you see on Instagram today, but it just has a lot of character to it in a way that is pretty neat. And so that deer will hang on the wall forever. As far as I'm concerned, we're going to get it mounted. So.
Well, that's cool. Did you hang it in the backyard and offend your neighbor?
We were down in Fairbury, so we drug it into her dad's. Her dad lives down there, and we drug it into his garage. He's not a hunter, and so I think he just kind of tolerated us doing that. And then I got one of those cool 2 pulley systems for my garage, and I actually, when we got home last night, I cut it up quick so that I can go hunt roosters with you this weekend.
Well, very cool. So
no offending the neighbors this time, which is slightly disappointing. It's almost like not getting to put my deer below the Dimitri. It's like some of the patina comes off when the neighbors aren't appalled by you, at least a little bit.
I guess, and finally, my last question is: do you hunt out of a blind a lot?
The last 4 or 5 years we have almost exclusively during the rifle season, just because we try to bring our kids, and Steph's afraid, like not just kind of afraid of heights, like quite afraid of heights, which is, it's a convenient thing for a Nebraskan. You don't have a lot of heights around here. And so we have avoided getting her into a tree stand. And so when she and I hunt together, we hunt in the ground blind, and then, with the kids, I don't know, short of a spot and stock or something, I don't even know how else you'd do it other than a ground blind with the kids, because they sit still like ants. So yeah, we've been hunting deer out of a blind, and you can definitely tell they see it and they hang up a little bit, but we've not noticed them not close or not just physically change their behavior longitudinally. Yeah, they definitely hang up when they first see it, but for the last couple of years, we've had deer, even mature deer, close. It helps that Nebraska's rifle season is during the rut, if there's a such thing as that helping. But it definitely helps hunter success, and when you have new hunters in the blind and you're rifle hunting the rut, it without question is a great way to sell more deer licenses.
I almost wish I would have put up a blind this weekend, because I had my brother's friend who had never hunted deer before out, and I know the tree stand thing was a complication. For those of us that have spent time in hanging stands or ladder stands, standing on that little platform and pivoting around and being able to shoot back behind you, those are things that you practice. It's a skill you develop. You overcome kind of those fear of heights. But if you don't have a chance to practice, it's hard to do. And if you're out there and you're in single digit weather and you're freezing your butt off and you're shivering, there's absolutely no chance. And that was one of the feedback points I got from Chris, who hunted with us this past weekend, was that I know you said that I could stand up and shoot back behind me, but there was no way I was going to be able to. So he asked me the last day, he says, would it be okay if I just stayed on the ground? Because he was hunting by himself, like he wanted to. And so I said, yeah, but you're not going to want to sit in the, right below the stand, because the stand was in a bunch of tall marsh grass. So I had him sit up a little farther up and look, and obviously it didn't work out. He didn't see deer, but I accomplished my goal. I put him in what I thought was going to be the best stand on our property so that he'd have the best chance at seeing deer. And he did. He saw a bunch of deer. And he said he wasn't going to shoot a yearling, what we call fawns in Minnesota, but he said he wasn't going to shoot one because he didn't know if he could bring it home to his wife. But then he talked himself into it when there was one hanging out in front of him for quite a while. And he was shaking, and he said it was from the cold, not from buck fever. But when he lifted his gun in 8-degree weather and he squeezed the trigger, and he said, well, it made a click, but it wasn't a very loud one, and it was kind of weird. And so he bolted his shell out of his gun, and he went to try again, and it didn't go off. And he learned the lesson of why we don't heavily oil our firing pins.
Yeah.
Oh no! His firing pin jammed?
Yeah, his firing pin was frozen. He couldn't find the shells down in the snow on the ground to see if there wasn't even an indentation on them. But he came in, told us what happened, and well, first of all, he was not shooting federal ammunition, which I almost kicked him out of camp immediately for that, but I didn't.
What kind of mentor are you?
Well, he's an experienced shooter. So, he's been shooting a long time, so he felt confident in his choice. And I am not going to blame the ammunition on this one. He was shooting a Remington 700, and we pulled the bolt out and disassembled it, and it warmed up, and immediately we saw there was a ton of oil in there. And, in 9-degree weather, he was using Rem oil, so another non-Vista Outdoor product. Strike number 2. Strike number 3, obviously, being the fact that he didn't get a deer. But Rem oil or any regular gun oil is going to gel up when it's that cold, and if you've got a lot of it, gun might not go off. And in his case, it didn't. So he got the click of disappointment, but he's excited. He's going to come back. Otherwise, everything else was good about the weekend. It was just really, really cold, and we had deer around, not as many as I would have hoped. But our big issue in my part of the country is we had such a heavy acorn crop this year that the ground is still covered with acorns, and the deer are feeding on acorns, and so our hunting land, the way that we kind of set it up is we've got beans and some other crops that are on the south end, and we always like to pull them out to those feed, and then we try to intercept them as they're going back to their bedding areas. They're not leaving their bedding areas, they're just staying out in the woods in the oaks and eating acorns all day. So that complicated our hunt a little bit, but my dad got a good one. He shot, it was probably, if you're into scores, it probably scored 125, 130, but a good mature 4-year-old buck. And he'd been sitting on his stand religiously and not seeing anything. But when the deer came out, it was a deer we described him as the G2 buck. We don't give names to our deer, but we'd been seeing a couple of different bucks on the cameras that we thought were probably some pretty decent deer, and one of them had really long G2s compared to the rest of his antlers, and so that was the deer he got, so we were pretty excited about that. So Chris got to experience us cutting up a deer, and since it was so cold, we cut it up immediately because we didn't want it to freeze solid, and we got it into the fridge to keep it warm enough to work with, frankly. So how often do you have to do that? Put it in the fridge to keep it warm to work with?
That's a very Minnesota thing to say.
Exactly. And then, there's less room for beer in the fridge at that point too. But we got them all cut up, and I did something for the first time. So Chris is a big fan of Steve Rinella, and Rinella apparently just did a podcast where he talked about eating deer tongues and elk tongues. And so I figured out how to cut the tongue out of this deer, and Chris is going to take that home and prepare the deer tongue for his wife.
Oh man!
So we ate the heart, we ate the tenderloins for lunch, and that was awesome. And then so that everything was still warm as we were cutting it up to throw it in the frying pan. And so we fried up some heart, and we fried up the tenderloins, and I sent him home with the tongue. But he can come back and get tongues anytime he wants. He's welcome back to hunting camp next year.
You gave him a tongue bashing.
Yeah.
So this guy, Chris, is going to take his first venison home to his wife, and it's going to be tongue?
Yeah. Well, and it's just a frozen tongue. It's not prepared or anything at this point, so he'll have to boil it, peel it.
Ballsy.
Well, he's kind of a foodie, and his wife is a tremendous baker. I don't know if she cooks other things, but I've had her baking before. So I think it'll be cool. And he just kept asking me questions about Steve Rinella. I got a little bit sick of it. I said, "Hey, I've got a podcast too. All right."
So you must have a shortage of venison if all you gave him was the tongue.
Well, no, we cut it up and had it quartered, and it's in the fridge, so it'll sit in the fridge for a day or two before we actually cut it up into packages. We'll get him some actual real venison, but we've only got one dead deer in the freezer at this point, so muzzleloader season's going to have to provide, or I'm going to have to get an elk here next month, or the Bronson family's going to starve to death.
What about you, Mr. McKean? You hunt deer?
Yeah, I hunt deer a few times. Although this has been a really interesting year. I have not hunted deer that much, just by myself, solo, kind of like I like to, even with my kids. This has been the year of the beginning hunter in my world. We've kind of been a destination for people who want to figure stuff out, and so it's been fun. But I've learned maybe more than they have about kind of the nuts and bolts of kind of mentoring, I guess. And so it started last week. This kid who's kind of stuck up his hand when we asked for beginning hunters as part of our county-wide mentoring program, beginning hunting program, actually flew up here from Billings, Montana. I'm not going to mention his name because I want to keep him at least a little anonymous, but 23-year-old, just graduated from college, kind of at that pivotal time of life, not really sure what he is going to do, although he's got a lot of interest. He's done a lot of job interviews, but he's in that kind of just shiftless post-college time when he's just between things. And so this actually worked out really well. He's never hunted in his life, but his grandfather was a big hunter, and his grandfather had always promised him that he would take him hunting. And life gets in the way, and the grandfather died before he could take his grandson hunting. And so the skillet was white hot for this kid to get involved. And when we put out a call for participants, he answered the call. And so he flew up here from Billings on this little twin-engine turboprop, which I thought was brave. I mean, to just show up meet a stranger. He actually stayed at our house for a couple of days, and that's how badly this kid wanted to hunt. Dinger, you've mentioned this in the past. If somebody's going to just answer an ad in the paper, that's one thing. To answer an ad in the paper, fly to a different town, meet a stranger to go hunting, I owed him everything that I could muster. And so, he brought his grandfather's 300 WSM. That was his deer rifle. I said, wow, that's a lot of gun for a deer, but we'll figure this out. It's great. Let's, is it sighted in? He said, sure it is. Well, I never believed that is the case. And so I said, we better go to the range. But I also wanted to just see how his gun handling skills were. I'm kind of a hard ass when it comes to gun safety. And I wanted to just make sure that he was safe. And on the way out to the airport, it's only a few minute drive from the airport to the gun range. We're making small talk. And I said, how recently did you take hunter education? He said, a couple of years ago. And I said, do you remember the 4 rules of gun safety that we teach here in Montana? And he rattled them off verbatim. Like, this kid's going to be just fine. But then there was a little lull in the conversation, and I could tell there's something on his mind. He says, I probably didn't tell you previously, but, and then he stopped. I'm like, ooh, I wonder what this is going to be. And he said, oh, I have narcolepsy. I'm like, okay. All right, well, we'll see. This is going to be interesting. I think I didn't quite spit my coffee into the windshield. I'm driving along, but I think I did audibly gasp. And he said he was so cool about it. He just said, it's nothing to worry about. I manage it with medication, and it's probably important that I get a nap a day. And I said, so I'm like, all right, how do I know that you haven't just checked out in the middle of this hunt? And he's like, if you see my shoulders slump, it's probably a good sign I've fallen asleep. I'm like, well, what do I do? I'm just trying to get trained up on this. He said, tell me a funny joke and I'll snap right out of it. So that was kind of our mantra for the whole
Oh,
deal.
your specialty.
Right. Yeah. Well, then I got a little terrified. Like, I don't really know very many funny jokes. And like, to have to come up with one at the spur of the moment to get this guy out of his reverie, I don't know how I'm going to do it. Luckily, I never had to. He was alert the whole time. We did manage the situation with regular napping, but one of the things I experienced with this guy was a little bit what Bronson was talking about, just the unfamiliarity with the physical mechanics of hunting. You got to move your body in some awkward ways and often kind of in a time imperative. And this kid just had a hard time kind of getting that right. I asked him what he wanted to hunt, mule deer or whitetail, and he said, whatever. He was kind of agnostic about that. Well, it was really muddy. We got as cold as you guys did, but before it froze up, it rained, and so it's just sloppy mud everywhere. We couldn't get to where we wanted to hunt whitetail, so we went a mule deer on foot. And what I noticed before I dropped the punchline of what happened with the hunt is, here's a kid who's, like I said, between things. He's maybe a little bit overweight. He realized in the course of hunting that he was more overweight than he knew, and he had the candor to talk to me about it. He's like, I'd like to get in better shape. I want to do a lot more of this. And I can see I'm holding myself back by not being able to move as well as I could. Again, I think for a 23-year-old man to admit that to a stranger, it kind of tells you the crucible that hunting creates, like this really private moment to exchange a lot more than just hunting. Like, that was a pretty personal revelation.
Well, and disclosing it to a McKenyan who's got 0% body fat.
Well, what did you say? Have you ever considered running 20 miles a day?
We struck out for 2 full days of hunting, and we're in a pretty target-rich environment in terms of mule deer, but we just couldn't quite put it together. And I was starting to worry a little bit about, I don't think he was going to have a shot opportunity. It was 2 full days. His last day was this past Monday, and that's when our cold weather really hit. I thought, you know what, let's go down, and we're going to just play the wind and post up in a place where we don't have to walk around. We'll just let the deer feed out to us, because that's one way to manage some of those mechanical problems. And I mean, it worked like a charm. He took a longer shot than he really wanted. He wanted to get something inside 200 yards. But this little buck stopped at about 218 yards. I gave him the range, and he just got super comfortable on his pack. This was a very compliant buck. Just stood out there for long enough that he could get comfortable. And he finally said, I'd like to take the shot. He did, and he shot a beautiful little buck. And then really the highlight for me was he pulled out his dad's old-timer knife, or his granddad's old-timer knife, and we took apart that deer with that knife, and he just kept talking about his granddad and how proud his granddad would have been of him. I was just really proud of the kid. He pulled it all together when he needed to.
That's cool.
How cool.
So that was the first kind of mentor deer hunt. And then I've mentioned this fella's name on our podcast previously. He's a religious listener of us. This guy's name is Nick Fasciano. He's from California, and he's a beginning hunter who's in his upper 20s and has come lately to hunting, but he has hit it hard. And he's really just thrown himself at hunting all year. He hunted bear in California and blacktail in California. He hunted elk in Idaho and in Colorado, and he was close a number of times, but just had not gotten it done. And I had met him actually at a powder hook event back in May, and I had said, if you're interested, you're welcome to apply for an antlerless mule deer tag here in Montana. If you get it, then you got a place to hunt. And he drew it. So he came out a couple days ago. I mean, fired up. You can imagine. He drove out from California because he wants to take every shred of meat back home. So he got here late on Friday. Saturday morning, I had to break the news to him that we were not going to go hunting. Instead, we owed it to our neighbors to go work cows. This is the season not only of the deer rut, but also when all the ranchers in my country are starting to ship calves. And anytime I'm around, we try to help out the neighborhood. So he got his introduction into sorting and shipping calves. He didn't get quite kicked, but he certainly got a lot of hooves flown his direction. He just managed to avoid contact. But I think in the final analysis, that might be the best day of his hunting life, was not hunting, but actually working with all of the neighbors who pitched him great doses of crap, being a Californian dude out here in the stock pen, but he handled it really well. So yesterday, that was Saturday, we were working cows. Yesterday, it was the last day of antelope season, and I had a doe antelope tag. I thought, boy, to complete his education, I'd at least invite him out to see if he wanted to go. And we spent all day hunting antelope. We finally got a doe at the end of last night, but it was cool to see a beginning hunter figure out, and this is a Californian who's used to hunting oak brush and kind of closed in, tight terrain. Antelope are out in the wide open, and he's a real tactician, Nick is. He figured out how to use the terrain to get close and how to use the wind, and it culminated in I made a shot at a great antelope. And so that was a great experience for him. Finally, today, it was his turn, and we got up early and headed out for mule deer. And about an hour and a half ago, we hung his very first big game animal on the tines of my front end loader on my tractor, which means, it's kind of it means you've really arrived as a hunter when that happens. And I don't think you could poke holes enough in this kid to get him down out of the rafters. He is sailing pretty high. He's pretty happy. The punchline is he's got a whitetail tag too. So we're going to try to go out this evening, and man, I don't know if his mind space can handle 2 deer in one day, but we're going to sure try it.
So you're kind of the Mr. Miyagi of deer hunting. Basically you made the guy go paint a fence, and what else did Mr. Miyagi have the kid do? Wax the car and do all of these other things before he actually got to, do karate. So you take him to the stock pens, you take him antelope hunting for yourself, and then at some point he catches a fly with chopsticks and he's allowed to go hunting.
And if all works out, I might even give him the tongue of the animal he killed.
So sweet.
So I was trying to, take a big picture approach to this whole, incremental mentoring weeks. It's taken a lot of time out of my life. I got a daughter with a used sheep tag. She wants to go hunt. We got a couple of elk tags, and I honestly don't know that we're going to get a chance to go after them for ourselves. But so I'm trying to, kind of extract lessons from this mentoring thing. And actually, one of the things I've noticed is, at least so far with these 2 examples, and I've got another couple of guys coming up this next weekend who are also beginning hunters. I was interested, Bronson, that you said that Chris was interested in going out by himself. So I've asked everybody if that's what they would like to do. Just, have kind of a solitudinous experience. And I'm right there. If they get something down, call me. I'll come help them. And so far, at least, they're more interested in sort of having I'm not going to say a guided experience, but one that's where the mentoring is happening in real time right now, rather than them kind of figuring things out. But I think certainly for Nick, that's the next stage, is he's going to want to go out by himself and figure it out. And I think that's this is a good way to get started, but I think that's a necessary next step. So we'll see if it happens.
So the guys that are coming in, you got any roofing work you need to get done before you go out? Or
Lots of floors need buffing.
You do have a new house.
I have a new house. That's the other thing. We've kind of suspended our lives. Like, our new house is barely habitable. Like, we've got no sofa in front of this great fireplace. Like, there's everybody's kind of sleeping on temporary beds. But that's all right. It's hunting season. We'll finish.
I mean, you probably have what, 200 mule deer on your property. You figure 6 hours of labor per deer. That's 1,200 hours. I mean, that's a good 7 months of, total man productivity at 40 hours a week. I would say you could probably finish it off with just a mule deer on your property.
Maybe. I'm starting to enter selfish mode, though, because I would frankly like to get a little work done myself. These stories aren't going to write themselves, but so far I really haven't found a time to work on them.
Well, you got to put bread on the table, not just meat.
So deer season in Montana, I'm guessing because it's been so cold, you guys are probably past your rut, right?
Yeah, it's been an interesting one. I think it started a little bit late, and by the time I noticed, chasing was going on, and there was all that kind of grab-assing going on of the young bucks and stirring up the young fawns of the herd, which is kind of how I start to see the rut happening. Those are the agitators. They're almost like the electrical covalent, disrupting the equilibrium of stuff.
Did you use covalent in a sentence just now that wasn't chemistry?
I might have. Yeah, so it's starting to, I guess you'd call this the lockdown phase. The bigger bucks are definitely with the does, and they're still sort of sorting through them and milling around, but there's not that pinball effect of bucks just careening wildly across the landscape like there was last week.
And Ryan, up your way, it's got to be over as well, right?
I think the peak is past, but I think the bucks are still running around. I mean, when you were telling the story about your deer that you shot, or that Stephanie shot, and he was still standing there, I'm thinking, yeah, he's dying. He's standing on his feet, ready to bleed out, but there's a doe still there, so he's thinking, I still got a chance.
Like pumping an old man full of Viagra.
Right. I mean, the rut is a strong driver for those deer, and thank God it is, because they do some stupid things and unexpected things. But no, I think the rut is still going on. It was funny here where we didn't see a lot of scrapes early on, but this week we got a little snow and there were scrapes all over the place the next day. So they were out being very, very active, just pretty nocturnal. Or if they were out, at the times of the day when all of us were too froze to stay in the woods, and we came in, which I think was part of it.
Hey, I would be remiss not to explain Stephanie's 3-shot deer. I can just hear her right now, if she listens to this, explaining to me how I may have misled our listener. So the first shot, I thought hit the deer, and it definitely acted like it had been hit. And then, as I told you, the third shot was kind of the kill shot. When I cleaned the deer last night, the deer's front shoulder was completely gone. So she had hit the deer the first time, just a little far forward. And I think that deer was probably going to die, but it would have taken quite a while. So she did not miss the first shot. She would have me tell you that. I'm certain of it. And now I feel better, and we can carry on the conversation. The reason I asked you guys about the rut is I'd love your take on this. And I think a lot of states do it to some degree, but for some reason in Nebraska, because we're bordering Iowa and Missouri and places that aren't known for this, Nebraska's rifle deer season happens usually right around the middle of the rut. It's a 9-day season, and invariably the peak happens somewhere right in the middle of that 9 days. And, your avid archery hunter, you're probably most avid deer hunters really, really grouse about it. In fact, Nebraska Game and Parks put out
your most avid bow hunters. Your most avid bow
hunters. Sure. So Nebraska Game and Parks put out a call for questions, and their feed on Facebook was overtaken by people grousing about, moving the deer season out of the rut. A very loud, as I would estimate, a very loud minority of deer hunters. What are your thoughts? I mean, clearly the season has been during this 9-day period, the second weekend through the third weekend of November, for as long as I've been around in Nebraska. And it's there, I assume, because it helps with harvest numbers, and good harvest numbers probably help with license sales. What are your thoughts? I mean, it seems like Nebraska's got a healthy deer herd. I bet we don't shoot on average as mature of a deer as Iowa maybe shoots, but it seems they're solving for the average person. Does that seem like the right way to do it? All other things, let's say the biology aside, all other things equal, do you think that's the right way to go about it?
Well, I can't speak to every state because I don't know exactly what their histories are. I do know here in the upper Midwest, Minnesota has always timed their rifle deer season, their gun deer season during the rut. And the biological background for that was, in the early days of deer hunting, they didn't want to over-harvest does, and they didn't limit doe harvest in the early days. So by putting it during the rut, it increases the buck harvest, and that's absolutely true. I mean, you kill more bucks during the rut than you do elsewhere because they're running around doing stupid stuff because their hormones are raging. And so I look at Minnesota, where we've got 400,000 gun hunters and we've got 70,000 bow hunters. Do you completely rearrange traditions that have developed, strong traditions about the timing of the deer seasons to accommodate the 60 or $70,000 or 60 or 70,000 hunters, knowing that the gun hunters will have a lower success rate? I don't know if that's a priority. Now, the upside of if a state does that, you absolutely will protect more deer, more bucks, and get them to maturity. That'll absolutely happen. And if that's a priority for a state, moving the gun season out of the rut is an option. Wisconsin, right next door, has largely the same latitudes and the same rut times as us. Their season opens later, 2 weeks later than the Minnesota season, and they've got a lot more bow hunters in their state, in part probably because bow hunting during that time of year is really good because they get to bow hunt the rut and there's no gun hunters out. But it's a trade-off. So if you're trying to appeal to the greatest number of consumers and citizens, then having the rut gun hunt coincide probably makes some sense. I don't have strong feelings either way, but I like the tradition. I like that the first weekend of November, my whole family gathers at our farm. That we might not all get together for Christmas, but we get together for deer season. And changing the timing of the gun season, moving it later, I mean, man, it was 9 degrees out there this weekend. You move it into later November, December, January, now all of a sudden you're dealing with even colder weather. So I there's no perfect. So I think state wildlife agencies have to balance for the greatest number of needs, and it's not always easy. But bow hunters, and I say this as a lifelong bow hunter. I haven't hunted for a few years, but bow hunters always complain, even though they've got the longest seasons and the most opportunities of all of us in the hunting world. They always would like one more thing, and the rut is one of them. So Iowa, Illinois, Wisconsin, they do it, and they've got good trophy bucks. So there's trade-offs. Now I've offended the bow hunting world. Please send your letters to Andrew McKean at powderhook.com.
Well,
which will be rejected.
I'll offend the rest of the world. So Montana has got, I think, it's a state that manages for opportunity. We have a 6-week bow hunting season, and there's a break of a week, and then a 5-week rifle season. That's opportunity. I mean, there is an ample opportunity to hunt what you want. We do hunt deer, whitetail and mule deer during the heat of the rut, and we shoot a lot of bucks. We probably minimize or depress the maturity of our bucks because they're getting, especially mule deer on public land, are highly visible. And they're getting cropped off as younger age classes. But my take on it is, I look at some of the other Western states that manage for premium opportunities for mature animals, and you might not draw that tag, but once every 15 or 20 years, I think in Utah especially, you can hunt every single year in Montana. You can hunt with your family. Everybody can get a general deer tag. You might not shoot the biggest bucks in the West, but you're going to get a chance to hunt every time. And the reality of it is, there's enough land and light enough hunting pressure in the hard enough to reach places that there definitely are some bucks that survive the rut and survive to an old age class. And so I think we got to have the best of both worlds.
Hey, while we're on the topic, one of the goals of our podcast is to teach our listeners. So would one of you guys mind explaining why we're managing for deer? That's probably something everybody understands, but how do they go about deciding how many permits to issue and where and that kind of thing?
All yours, Bronson.
Well, it's pretty different from place to place. So here in Minnesota, if you want to hunt deer with a gun or a bow, you can. There's no limit on the number of permits. What we manage for here for the population is sometimes we will restrict the harvest of does, the reproducers. So taking a buck out of the population takes a buck out of the population. Taking a doe out of the herd usually means that you're taking 2.5 deer out of the herd, because they'll have a fawn, often twins, the next year. So that accelerates. So if you protect your does, that's how you manage your population. That's how we do it in Minnesota. So zone by zone, they'll set basically a quota, and if they want to grow the population, they restrict antlerless tags, and if they want to decrease the population, they'll increase antlerless tags, make everybody get one, and allow you to shoot 2 or 5, is when we were at the peak of our population. Out west, it's very, very different, where you don't get to always hunt every year in a lot of the hardcore Western states. So they limit the number of licenses available. You generally have a pretty good idea what the success rate is. That's fairly constant from year to year. So if you know that success rates are 20% and you give out 100 tags, you're going to kill 20 deer. So you can do your calculations. So the important thing for wildlife managers is having a good idea of how many deer are on the landscape, what are the conditions that they dealt with that year, and because you don't know what next year is going to be like. You can't manage for the future drought or the future blizzard. You can only manage for the conditions that you've got this year. But if you've had healthy reproduction the last couple of years and you can sustain higher harvest, then you can increase the number of tags. So it can be very complex math, or it can be fairly simple.
I think one of the issues is when people complain about some of those inputs, it's either a misunderstanding about the baseline knowledge. So what population surveys are saying, how are surveys being done? For like antelope and often mule deer, they're existing in big expanses of open country. So biologists will take seasonal flights and count them. And they've got long-term trend data. They can kind of extrapolate from what they see from year to year to get a pretty good fix on what that total population is. It gets to be a little tougher in the tighter cover where whitetail live. Mm-hmm. Brian, you want to talk a little bit about how biologists monitor or assess baseline populations in whitetail country?
Yeah, well, for the most part, they're building models based on past data. And so they're not always going out and trying to count deer numbers and see if that's actually true, what's on the landscape. So they've got models that carry over from year to year, and then every once in a while they'll do flyovers. So in the winter you can do flyovers and count deer fairly reliably, because if you're in deciduous country, because the leaves are gone and white snow, you can see them. Not as easy in the coniferous parts of the state, but that's very rare that wildlife agencies spend money going out doing, airplane surveys. There was a time when wildlife managers would go out and do pellet counts. They'd count droppings. They'd There's a few models out there where you can drag a trail and count tracks every day, and what you end up doing is you build an index that isn't an exact hard count on the number of deer on the landscape, but it's a pretty good estimate, and you end up ground truthing things. But by and large, they'll plug in what the harvest was. They'll plug in what the weather conditions were. You can usually, based on how harsh the winter is up north, you can figure out how many deer you think are going to die, how many you lost from the population, how many you took via hunting. Now we have to manage and estimate how many are being taken by other predators like wolves and bears, and you just build that model. And if you're wrong and you over harvest, the hunters are going to tell you about it pretty quick, and then they have to go in and evaluate. But there's no magic easy way to go out and count deer, and it's really expensive to do the monitoring, to do real reliable population assessments year after year after year. Most hunters want wildlife agencies spending money on habitat work and not going out counting the same deer every year. But those are the parts. It's not easy. And let me tell you, the worst job to have in a state wildlife agency for public feedback is being the big game deer manager, because everybody knows who you are and they're not happy with what you're doing.
And everybody knows more than you.
Yeah, and everyone is got an opinion based on what they saw from their deer stand, and for that little segment they are experts, but they try to extrapolate their personal experience over a landscape, and then they tell you how you're wrong. And your big fancy, you might be a PhD deer biologist that studied under Brian Murphy with Quality Deer Management Association. You still are not qualified to manage deer. You don't know nothing. So it's a hard job. I would never accept that job in state government anywhere. I'm not qualified to do it, but that probably makes me overqualified.
So it's interesting. And this is one of the things that I think a novice hunter would wonder about is why, if we sell, quote unquote, unlimited buck tags in Montana, why are there still deer left? Why does that not have a negative imprint on the population going forward?
One buck can breed a whole bunch of does, and one rooster pheasant can breed a whole bunch of hens. One tom turkey can breed a whole bunch of hen turkeys. So harvesting males out of the population generally doesn't have all that big of impact overall on the population. You're just taking out that one individual animal. So unlimited buck tags, what you end up hurting is the quality of the deer. If you want to see big mature bucks, having unlimited harvest of bucks is going to make that hard, but there's almost always going to be enough bucks to spread their semen and impregnate does to keep the population reproducing.
And, land management also affects this. So if there's a lot of private land, there are going to be deer sanctuaries, places that people don't hunt, or at least don't hunt to the same level that they may on public land. And so that composition of land ownership is also a big factor into some of these models.
Sure, because, even in whitetail country, my area is almost exclusively private land. It's intensively hunted, but you got all of us practicing our own deer management priorities on our own property. We're protecting a lot of deer. I let 6 small bucks go this year that weren't big enough for me to put on the wall, so I didn't shoot them. So I was holding out for a nice mature doe, which never appeared in my sights this year. So that was a management decision that I made at the individual landowner level. That happens a lot of places. You can't build policy around that, though.
We've mentioned at the front of the show, this is the deer hunting podcast. Unless there's some other education we need to do, I have to let you know that Nick Fasciano is a long-term listener of this podcast, and he is really keen to go feed Dimitri. I said, hey, dude, didn't you understand what we're not doing that anymore? It's the CWD environment. He said, do antelope carry CWD? Couldn't we feed this antelope carcass to Dimitri?
So
I hate to let a listener down, so we're going to go feed Dimitri.
moral of that story is if you listen to this podcast, Andrew will take you hunting and put you to work.
Yeah.
Well,
I got some fence needs painting.
Well, I do have one educational thing that we need to do before we end this podcast, because I've been asked this a couple of times over the last couple months. I want to emphasize to people that Andrew McKean, co-host of the On Gravel podcast and content guru for Powderhook, is not from Park City, Utah, and is not a professional skier, and did not get arrested for stealing a deer stand and trail camera off of public land in Utah. I've had a couple of different people ask me, why are you still talking to that guy? Because they thought you were the Andrew McLean. I think there's only one letter difference in your names that was in the media here last month. And I just want to make sure the world knows that you are not the same person, and that if you were, I would have shunned you and kicked you off this podcast already.
Well, I'm happy to know that I am not public enemy number 10 yet.
So does that make our since you can unilaterally kick him off the podcast, does that make our podcast an anarcho-syndicalist commune as well?
I think it's an electrical covalent.
Well, I could have boycotted our podcast. That's but I don't know. We haven't gone over the bylaws of what we can and can't do from a governance standpoint. So I think we're an anarcho. I don't know if we're a syndicalist collective yet.
Time will tell.
Okay, you guys figure that out. I'll abide by whatever governing structure you come up with. That's how interested I am.
Well, good luck feeding Dimitri. Your antelope, and good luck getting another hunter a new species of deer.
Okay, well, we'll report back how it went. It's time for the sign off. Until next week, keep it on gravel.